Everybody, and welcome back to the Slightly Scientific Podcast, coming to you from the podcasting studio at Ibstock Place School. I'm Oliver, and sitting next to me is Honor.
Hello. Today we're sharing with you an interview we had with Dr. Martin Blaser, who holds the Henry Rutgers Chair of the Human Microbiome and is a Professor of Medicine and Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at Rutgers University.
So I thought before we get on to the interview, I would share some context, as one of the reasons why I reached out to Dr. Martin Blaser was because a year beforehand, my biology teacher, shout out to Mr. Lamb, recommended that I read his book called Missing Microbes. In his book, Marty talks about how precious and ancient our microbiome is and how our overuse of antibiotics is destroying it. I knew that antibiotics could cause resistance, but this idea that they were driving what Marty calls modern plagues, such as obesity, diabetes, and food allergies, stuck with me, and that's why I was so keen to have this interview. So I really hope that you enjoy.
Okay, so my name is Martin Blaser. I'm a medical doctor who became a scientist. I'm working as a professor at Rutgers University. I carry the title of the Henry Rutgers Professor of the Human Microbiome, and also direct something called the Center for Advanced Biotechnology and Medicine, all of which is pretty interesting for someone whose training is studying medicine, not studying science.
So my first question is actually about antibiotic resistance. In 2013, the BBC was reporting that antibiotic resistance poses a catastrophic effect. In 2010, US healthcare providers prescribed 258 million courses of antibiotics to their patients. How much worse and bleak does the threat of antibiotic resistance look?
Let's go back about 80 or 90 years to the time that Fleming, a Brit, discovered penicillin at St. Mary's Hospital in London, probably somewhere in your neighborhood. Infectious diseases were always a scourge of humankind. People died from pneumonia. They died from infection. They fell out of a tree and broke a limb, and they would die from the infection. Women died in childbirth of infection. So the discovery and the utilization of antibiotics was a huge milestone, just enormous. One of the greatest inventions of the 20th century. And in fact, in all areas of life and science. Part of the reason that everybody thinks of antibiotics as being pretty miraculous, because in the right situation, they are miraculous. And in fact, all of modern medicine is based on having antibiotics that work. If you don't have antibiotics that work, then surgery becomes too dangerous. Chemotherapy becomes too dangerous. Transplantation is impossible. Mm-hmm. Our whole medical edifice is based on antibiotics that work. And since antibiotics were first used, resistance has been rising. It's been rising continuously since that time. Basically, the more antibiotics we use, the more resistance there is. And so it just keeps increasing. And it's getting to the point that people are dying because they have bacteria, and especially bacteria, that cannot be treated with the current antibiotics.
What is the scale of these untreatable infections?
One of the problems with antibiotics is that they're so overused. Because of the great belief in their miraculous nature by both the medical profession and the public, antibiotics are just wildly overused. In the United States, the Center for Disease Control estimated that a third of all antibiotic courses are unneeded. My own estimate is somewhere between 50 and 60% of all courses are not needed. So if antibiotics are needed, then actually for those courses, resistance doesn't matter, because it was unnecessary in the first place. But most antibiotics are used for people who have mild infections. a very small fraction are used for people who have really serious and life-threatening infections, maybe 5 or 10% at most. And of those, antibiotics and resistance means that sometimes you can't use the first line antibiotic, you have to use the second line or the third line antibiotic. So there's an impact. It's hard to give you an exact number. It could be in people who have serious life-threatening infections, it's currently affecting 1 to 3% of all of them, maybe 5%, but the numbers are going up. And part of the struggle, part of the challenge is to hold those numbers in check so that they do not go up.
Yeah. So out of interest, do you believe that antibiotics should only be prescribed to people in those life-threatening situations where they absolutely need them?
That's a simple approach to a complicated problem. I kind of view it more as a spectrum. For example, one of the most common uses of antibiotics around the world is to treat ear infections in young children. And ear infections are very common. Now, one of the things that we know is that most of those ear infections are caused by viruses. They're not even caused by bacteria, so antibiotics aren't actually necessary. But nevertheless, many people take antibiotics for the ear infections as prescribed by their doctor or their pharmacist or the person on the street selling antibiotics. So I like to think of ear infections as a spectrum from white to black. Black are those ear infections that are really severe, that child must get an antibiotic because it's so severe. And white is a case where the infection is so mild that a child should never get antibiotics. And then in between is a lot of gray, and different doctors cut that gray in different places. In Sweden, they're only using 40% of the antibiotics we use in the United States.
So, have I just spent 2 hours trying to figure out what the difference is between a defined daily dose and an antibiotic prescription? Maybe. But I have come back with some stats, and with that, a lesson in statistics. According to the Swedish e-health agency, in 2020, Sweden consumed 457 defined daily doses of antibiotics per 1,000 inhabitants. According to Public Health England, in 2019, England consumed 18.5 million defined daily doses. Now, in order to compare these two numbers, we need to use a common unit. In this case, we will opt for defined daily doses per 1,000 inhabitants. So if we assume a population of around 55 million people, this corresponds to about 337 defined daily doses per 1,000 inhabitants in England. Now, using defined daily doses is a typical unit used to measure and compare antibiotic consumption in different countries and regions, which is why you would assume that countries would report their antibiotic prescribing rates in defined daily doses. However, not the US, as I have found out. Anyway, according to data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, in 2019, there were approximately 270 million antibiotic prescriptions filled in outpatient settings in the US. And this corresponds to a rate of 822 antibiotic prescriptions per 1,000 inhabitants, and that does not help me with comparing anything. Thank you for listening to this rant. I'll close my Excel spreadsheet now.
So they're cutting that gray much closer to the white than we are. And again, amongst doctors, there's tremendous variation. And people who like to take antibiotics find doctors who like to prescribe antibiotics, and the opposite. I would like to help educate health practitioners about the costs of using antibiotics. Everybody's using antibiotics as if there's little or no cost in terms of health cost to the individual receiving it. That's kind of been the center of my work over the last 15 years, is to understand what the cost of taking a course of antibiotics is. Here's where it gets more interesting, because we all believe in the tremendous power of antibiotics, everyone around the world, and that's why they're used so tremendously. That 258 million courses of antibiotics in 2013, that's 5 courses of antibiotics for every 6 people, and that's been going on year after year. In the US, the average child is getting 3 courses of antibiotics by the time they're 2 and 10 courses by the time they're 10. And the numbers in England are actually quite similar. There are differences in country. In Europe, there's a north-south gradient. That many more antibiotics are used per capita in southern Europe than in northern Europe. One of the things that is really striking to me is how so many epidemics of chronic diseases have emerged in the last 70 years, have emerged and worsened, like obesity, asthma, food allergies, autism, inflammatory bowel disease. I could go on. It's a long list. And so if they're all emerging at the same time, are they due to completely different causes? Or perhaps there's one thing that's underlying them all. And my theory is that there is one thing that's underlying them all, and that is that our human microbiome has changed early in life. And a big culprit in that is antibiotics.
So, actually, at the very end of last year, the documentary The Invisible Extinction came out, which features Marty and his wife Gloria and their work on the human microbiome. I watched it last week with my mum, and I have to say, we both really enjoyed it. For example, I had no idea how powerful fecal transplants could be. It dives into a lot of topics that we didn't have time to cover on this podcast, such as allergies and possibly curing autism, potential problems with C-sections, and how we can better our microbiomes. It looks at the cutting edge of research right now. It is an independent film, and I think what it says is so important for our generation. So that's The Invisible Extinction.
And for me, the insight, the critical insight came about almost 20 years ago when I connected something that I had known for a long time with this phenomenon. And that was, what I knew is that farmers have been using antibiotics on the farm to feed to their livestock since antibiotics came into practice in the late 1940s. They feed the antibiotics so that they can fatten them up, so that the animals can get to market earlier. The farmers do it for chickens and turkeys and cows and sheep and swine. And the reason that they do it is because it works. Oh, and the farmers also found that the earlier in life they started the antibiotics, the more profound the effect. It increases their body mass. It increases their feed efficiency, the conversion of calories in food into body mass, which is what farmers are trying to do. Tremendous use of antibiotics around the world is on the farm, but to me, all of a sudden, this kind of lit a light bulb. So I thought, wow, if that works in farm animals, what are we doing to our kids? Maybe all those courses of antibiotics we're giving them, for example, for their ear infection, are having the unintended consequence of changing their metabolism, just like metabolism is changing on the farm. So it's that analogy that really got me going. And so we began to do studies in mice where we would give mice antibiotics or not and see what happens. And we've done many, many studies now, but just starting with obesity, we showed that if we gave mice antibiotics, they put on more fat and they got bigger. And if we put them on a high-fat diet, they also got bigger. And if we put them on a high-fat diet and antibiotics, they got big-est. We could show that the antibiotics were changing their microbiome, and this was changing how the mice were developing. And what we showed, that early life was really important. If we waited a while till the mice were older, the effect was much smaller.
That's quite a worrying discovery, actually. So it could be a cause for obesity.
You bet. And if you look at obesity, it is skyrocketing around the world. In fact, most of the overweight and obese children, most of the overweight children under 5 today are in developing countries. It's not just epidemic in developed countries, it's pandemic. But it's a slower pandemic than COVID, but it's going up year after year.
And that could all just be because of antibiotics.
Well, let me just say that it's not just, antibiotics are not the only factor, but they are, I think, a very important contributing factor. And that actually leads me to the next point, which is that the antibiotics are acting through their effect on the microbiome. The microbiome is all the organisms that live in the human body and that we have co-evolved with over millions of years. And now the microbiome is changing as a result of antibiotics. Certain microbes are disappearing. That's what I wrote the book Missing Microbes about, is the fact that microbes are disappearing. And actually there's now a film that's going to open in the United States and online on January 6th, called the Invisible Extinction, that pretty much features my work and my wife's work, and the work of other scientists in this field. And so I definitely recommend it to your blog viewers. But the point I want to say is that our microbiome is really important, and we get a big portion of our microbiome from mom. Mom passes down her microbiome to us, just like she passes down her genes. She's passing down her microbes and her microbial genes. And we have shown that if mom's microbiome is perturbed, she's passing a perturbed microbiome to the next generation. And in a model of inflammatory bowel disease in mice, we showed that passing down the perturbed microbiome increased their IBD. So it was actually not just leading to a change in the microbes, but actually leading to a change in disease. And we think that this issue is generational. And one of the reasons that a number of the problems have accelerated is that it's getting worse in each generation. And now in Western countries, we're in our 4th or 5th generation of antibiotics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so do you think there could be any alternatives to antibiotics? Like, for example, I've heard about how scientists have been looking into bacteriophages as an alternative to antibiotics. Do you know what sort of stage scientists are at with this research? And are there any other potential solutions or other alternatives?
Yeah, so there are many alternatives. The first alternative is to use antibiotics only when necessary. Again, I think that we could cut the use down in half if we educate health practitioners more, and we educate the public more, that antibiotics have cost. We're using it as if there's no cost, and that's clearly an error. Second point is that the whole thrust of discovery in antibiotics until recently has been to make broad spectrum antibiotics. That is, antibiotics that will kind of kill any infection, so that you don't have to know what the organism is. You can just use the antibiotic and the person will get well. Well, the problem with that is that it causes a lot of collateral damage, causes damage to the microbiome. That was never in the picture before, but it's clearly the case now. So I think we need to create narrow spectrum agents, not broad spectrum agents that will just target a single bug, like strep or E. coli. So we could make E. coli-cillin or strepsillin that is just against one drug. Now that against one bug, that could be a specific chemical, like an antibiotic. It could be a bacteriophage. There are a number of different alternative approaches, but the key concept is narrow, and bacteriophage fits that. In order to do this, though, we need better diagnostics. So if somebody has a sore throat or an ear infection, we have to know, is that caused by bacteria or virus? And if it's a bacteria, what's the resistance pattern for that bacteria? We basically have the technology to do all of this, but the market is broken. Why would someone do $1,000 worth of tests when you can prescribe a $5 antibiotic?
Oh yeah, that's true.
And that's kind of where the market is right now. That $5 antibiotic is a false economy because it's doing lots of damage.
Yeah, and it will cause a lot more problems than it will actually solve.
Well, it solves immediate problem, and the doctor in their office, what they're concerned about, and the parent whose child is crying, that's what they're concerned about. But we have to educate the profession and the public about this problem.
Is there anything being done to combat this dangerous incentive for pharmaceutical companies to only focus on broad spectrum drugs?
I mean, people who are expert in the field recognize this, but we've grown up in all of us have grown up in the age of antibiotics. Antibiotics are a sacred cow. In fact, we're addicted to antibiotics. It's a kind of medical addiction, and so we have to improve. Just like opium and morphine, these are great drugs to treat pain. They're really effective, but people become addicted to them. They overuse them, and that causes a lot of problems. So we have to change the mindset. That's the whole thing. And by the way, antibiotic resistance is just one factor of it. It's the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
The body of the iceberg is what antibiotics are doing to the microbiome. That's the big problem. And just like the iceberg, most of it is underwater. People don't even see it. I have a lot of ice analogies, and I
I'm loving them. They're brilliant.
yeah, well, I kind of see us like we've just boarded the Titanic, and it's sailing away, and the question is, can we miss the iceberg, or are we doomed to hit it? So I think we can miss it, but we got to work at it.
On what scale are we going to have to work at this? Is this something that can be done in 20 years, or is this something that needs to happen now?
Yeah, that's it. You're doing well. That's the kind of question that journalists like to ask all the time.
Well, thank you. I do my homework for this podcast.
But most scientists see things as a continuum. It's not like that we're at the cliff. It's like we're going downhill. And the sooner we stop going downhill and reverse course, the better. We've been digging a hole for 80 years with antibiotics. We have to stop digging that hole and start filling it in. And by the way, that's not just true in human medicine. That's true in the soil. We're degrading our environment. We see it on a macro scale. And what I'm telling you is the same thing is happening on a micro scale in the human body. It's the same phenomenon.
So essentially, this is happening everywhere. We need to get our act together. People say that you should have dogs and pets around your young kids and do lots of gardening to get some dirt under your nails. Does doing any of this actually contribute to a healthier and more diverse microbiome?
I don't think it contributes very much. And that puts me at odds with a number of people who think it's wonderful. But the problem is that we have a very human-specific microbiome that we've co-evolved with for millions of years, and we have lost a lot of our diversity. Some of our estimates is that we've already lost up to half of our biodiversity. So the microbes in soil, the microbes in your family dog, those are adapted to the soil and to the dog. They're not adapted to the human body. So the microbiome throws out those invaders right away. So I don't think they have a big effect. My wife thinks they're bigger. So, but time will tell. We have to restore the microbes that are missing, the ones that are clearly human adapted, that people out in the jungle have that we don't have.
So do you think there are any ways we can try and get a healthier, more diverse microbiome back?
Yeah, well, I think the key is that we're going to have to restore. We're going to have to restore the microbiome, and that's challenging to figure out how to restore it. I mean, people are doing fecal transplants, and that is moving a whole new microbiome into individuals for certain severe clinical conditions like C. diff colitis. It works very well, but will it work for other conditions? It's hard to say. If somebody's had obesity for 40 years, I'm not sure that turning around their microbiome today is going to help them.
So you see all these sort of things, like soap and like surface cleaners, basically saying, kills 99% of bacteria. But could this cause a loss of diversity in people's microbiomes? And how is this affecting antibiotic resistance and the problems that this poses?
Well, these are two different issues. Some time ago, people in industry learned that the public was afraid of germs. And so they started making antibacterial everything. Antibacterial soap, antibacterial counters, antibacterial toasters, you name it. And that's mostly marketing. But the problem is that we live in a world of bacteria. And most of the bacteria in the human body are good for us. When we wash our hands 20 times a day, are we doing more good or more harm?
Yeah.
So, kind of the mouthwash and sanitizers that we use in our daily lives, are these friend or foe?
Yeah, they're both. They're both. Again, you're looking for simple, world is black or world is white. It's mostly gray. So there are times when sanitizer is great. There are times when washing your hand is really important, like in the middle of flu season, or if you're in a hospital where there are a lot of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, you don't want to pass them to another person, or during COVID. But most of the time, uh, they may be doing more harm than good.
Most definitely. And actually, speaking of like flu season, in the UK, we're currently seeing a huge surge in strep A cases, especially in children. And some people think that this surge is due to the aftermath of COVID lockdowns. But what actually causes different diseases to sort of come back and proliferate?
That's a good, very terrific, simple question with a complicated answer.
I'm sure you get a lot of those kind of questions.
Yeah, no, but the answer is that for certain infections, it's based on the spread of the organism, it's based on the immunity in the population, it's based on the age structure of the population. For example, after kids were kind of locked down and not in contact with other kids, predictably, there would be big epidemics of transmissible diseases. And that's exactly what's happened, because instead of developing some degree of herd immunity, there was no immunity. So now the organism spreads in a non-immune population. It spreads fast. And so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that with flu. We're seeing it with RSV. We're seeing it with Group A strep, as you say.
Right. When people talk about the different strains of a disease, what are they talking about? And what makes certain strains particularly hot or infectious?
Yeah. So the answer is that microbes often mutate, especially viruses. They some of them their DNA producing capacity or RNA producing capacity is error prone, so that it will purposefully mutate, and then you have a cloud of variant viruses, and they use natural selection. The fittest one survives, and it passes on to the next one. Charles Darwin, an English person, was right. You can't really understand biology unless you understand natural selection. So there's selection for variants that come. So if variant A is circulating and people develop immunity to variant A, when variant B emerges, it's going to have an advantage because now you have a non-immune population. That's basically what happens with flu. Variants are emerging all the time, and the fittest one survives and becomes the dominant one this year. And as people become immune, now that variant doesn't have an advantage, and a new one comes along. There's also a very interesting phenomenon that you guys should read about. Before there was a measles vaccine, measles was an illness that basically all kids got, and they got it in the first few years of life. But there was a 3-year cycle of measles. Every 3 years there was a peak, even though the same number of kids were born every year. And that's all based on the kinetics of the movement of the virus in the population. It's a very interesting thing. You should read about it.
So I did some research, and I came across this paper called The Normal for Epidemic Diseases by A.W. Hedrick. And it's quite a cool paper, not only because it was written in the early 1900s, but also because it contains these graphs which show this weird secular trend. And if I may quote from this paper, "The invariable and orderly recurrence of the annual measles swing, and the familiar occurrence of annual waves for many other diseases, can only mean to the thoughtful observer that there must be at work one or more forces associated with the round of seasons, which produce the annual ebb and flow in disease." It is a very interesting read, which I will link in the show notes. Fantastic. That's all of our questions. Thank you so much for answering them.
I'm happy to talk to you. I'm glad you're doing this kind of thing. You're expanding your horizons and
Thank you very much.
exploring the world. It's good. So good luck. You look up there's a website. It's called the Invisible Extinction. You can see the trailer, and eventually in a couple weeks it's going to be on Apple and Amazon. And
I have watched it, and if you're into health or medicine and want to see for yourself how incredibly powerful a microbiome is, I would really recommend it. The Invisible Extinction.
Take care.
Thank you, and you.
Well, that wraps up another episode of the Slightly Scientific podcast. First of all, a huge thank you to Dr. Martin Blaser for a fantastic interview, for shining a light and offering some clarity on this highly talked about topic.
And thank you to all of you who listen to this podcast. You keep this podcast going, and we love any excuse to use this high-tech podcasting studio in the Innovation Centre here at Ibstock Place School. If you'd like to send us your thoughts or ideas on the show, you can find us on Twitter at @TheSlightlySci.
That's all for now. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope you have a wonderful day full of science.